Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. My name is Ken Moritsugu. I'm the news director for Japan and the Koreas for the Associated Press, and I'm your moderator here today. We're very honored to have Mr. Andray Abrahamian, who's a senior advisor to Choson Exchange today. Choson Exchange is a nonprofit that has been involved in training North Koreans in economics, entrepreneurship, and urban planning since 2010. As you all know, North Korea has been in the news again this week with yet another launch of a missile, which apparently was an ICBM, or at least a major step in that direction. But I think it'd be interesting today to hear from Andray, who will give us a slightly different perspective on some of the changes that are happening within North Korea, more on the economic front. Andray is currently senior advisor to Choson Exchange, but previously he was the executive director of the organization from 2012 to 2016. He's also lectured at the University of Yangon and at Ulsan University, teaching East Asian development models and East Asian international relations. He's also the author of a book comparing Myanmar and North Korea, which sounds like a very interesting topic. So without further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Andray.
Yeah, oh, great, fantastic. Thanks so much to the FCCJ for having me, and to Ken as well, and especially to Brad Martin for setting this up. Just when we were starting Choson Exchange in 2010, I turned to Brad for some advice, and he was generous with his time and his thoughts, and now here we are still leaning on him for help. Also thanks to Kim Jong-un for the ICBM tests yesterday, which has kept the crowd low so we can have a nice intimate conversation. I guess I'll just tell you a little bit more about Choson Exchange, and then I'll go into talking about the kinds of things that we've seen happening in the Kim Jong-un era in the economy, and what those changes that have taken place might mean for regime stability and for the daily life of Koreans, and how their society has changed expectations, certainly in Pyongyang. Choson Exchange, we began running programs in 2010 for North Koreans in entrepreneurship and economic policy. So two main tracks, one focused on business skills and the other focused on economic policies, the kind of policies that create a positive environment for business to take place. Since then, we have trained over 1,200 people in North Korea, and we've also brought over 100 North Koreans abroad to study as well, from 2-week-long intensive study programs all the way to master's degree programs that we help facilitate with universities in Singapore. So a common question we get is, does this really happen? What interests do the North Koreans have in studying this kind of thing? And that's really what we'll address today. Because when you look at the country, formally it looks very much like the country that some of you old-timers covered back in the 70s, 80s, perhaps even 60s. The design aesthetic of their cities and the language that they use in communicating their political goals and social goals, in some ways is so similar to what it has been ever since the country's inception. So last year they had a big party congress. It was the first since the 80s, and really the meetings that took place and the statements that were made could have been made in any decade in North Korea's history. The traditional the narratives that underpin society there also look very, very similar. The foundation really is anti-Americanism, and also a deep reverence for the leadership, in particular the Kim family. So that's a museum in Sinchon where a massacre is supposed to have taken place during the Korean War, and they've recently refurbished it about a year and a half ago, I believe, and it's become more graphic and more intense, and it's a place where they still bring school students from all around the country. So at a very young age, they're learning the same stories about the Americans that their parents and grandparents would have learned. And that picture on the bottom right, that's my favorite picture, my favorite painting from North Korea. It's all the peoples of the world gathered around Kim Il-sung to thank him for the Juche idea. It's also a unique place in that you can visit that museum, park your car, go to the toilet, and then go pledge your revenge at the revenge pledging place. Out of that party congress last year, though, there were really very few economic plans promulgated. The economy was not mentioned, and when it was in quite vague terms. And instead, again, what you saw was a very formal, very North Korean response to some of their perceived economic needs, and that was mass mobilization. So here, this is just outside Choson, and this is several hundred, possibly thousands of people all working on some site together. Hundreds of bikes lined up. They biked from the town to work at this site. Also in Choson. Before the Congress, which was in May, they had a 70-day speed battle, as they call it, which is, a nationally mandated overtime. And then after the Congress, they had another 200-day speed battle. And this again speaks to the uniqueness of North Korea. I don't think there's any other country in the world that could mobilize the majority of its population to work 50, 60-hour, 70-hour weeks in the way that they can. And then also, as everyone in this room well knows, in the last year or two, there's been a real shift to the military side of Byungjin, certainly in rhetoric, but also in terms of their testing schedule for missiles and nuclear weapons. Byungjin, it means the equal priority given to both the military and to economic development. Economic development has taken place, though, under Kim Jong-un, and it's become a really central part of his brand in North Korea. He came into power talking about quality of life, making promises. Very famously in his first speech, he said people will never have to tighten their belts again. And North Korean people associate what they've seen in the last few years with Kim Jong-un and his policies. And what they've seen is improved quality of life. One North Korean lady told me once, Kim Il-sung has made us ideologically strong, Kim Jong-il made us militarily strong, and so now Kim Jong-un can make us economically strong. And I think that's not an uncommon way of thinking about the Kim Jong-un era. What are those policies exactly? There was, by North Korean standards, a very aggressive period of 3 years or so in which they really were tinkering with the rules that govern their economy and the kinds of things that individuals could do in their economy. They gave more autonomy to a special economic zone that has been crawling along since 1994 in the far northeast. That's Rasan. They even allowed private ownership of a couple of apartments and a couple of buildings up there. They also rolled out a bunch of new SEZs, special economic zones, dotted all around the country, 24, 25 new SEZs. And perhaps most importantly, in 2012 and then again in 2013, they adjusted the rules that govern managing state-owned enterprises and cooperative farms. State-owned enterprises are of particular interest to us because that's what they did was they allowed entrepreneurship to take place under the umbrella of a state-owned enterprise or some other organ. So the way people start and run their own businesses is by creating their own little projects that eventually become autonomous. Then towards the end of 2013, some less positive steps were taken, the purge of Jangsung Tech, and then in 2014 into 2015, there was a quarantine in response to the Ebola pandemic, which, as you may recall, didn't really reach Asia at all. Orascom, a big Egyptian conglomerate who helped build their telecoms network, they found it increasingly difficult to remit any of their profits. And then the nuclear crisis also continued with a test in 2013. Really importantly, though, the changes that they made from 2010 to 2013 weren't rolled back. We've seen that happen once before. They tinkered with reforms in 2002, and then a few years later they pulled back a lot of those changes. Thus far, under Kim Jong-un, they have not really pulled back some of the changes they made. So increasingly, you see these entrepreneurs that I referenced before starting their own projects, turning them into businesses, and essentially managing their own economic destiny. We've seen that happen on at the lower rungs of society ever since the 1990s. In response to the famine, you saw people starting small businesses, trading just in order to survive. But what's happening now is you're seeing it increasingly in the middle and upper middle classes as well. And that's reflected in the kinds of products that you can find and services as well, especially in Pyongyang, but throughout the country. There are a lot more domestically made food products, processed foods. This, for example, these are onion ring chips and sweet potato chips. Those were not available 5 years ago, or rather, a Chinese-made version of a similar product would have been available. You get coffee shops and fancy restaurants in Pyongyang. Every year more seem to open. Competition is fierce for for consumer dollars or RMB. There are cars and taxi services. There are now perhaps 6 taxi companies all competing in Pyongyang. They're not particularly cheap either. It's about $1 a kilometer for a ride. And shops generally are fairly well stocked and have been for the last few years. These are all kinds of shops: hard currency shops, public distribution system shops, if you can call them that, and then the markets, both formal and less formal. That's one of the newer restaurants that makes, I guess we would call it craft beer in the outside world. The waitress there, you can see, has a very groovy name tag that scrolls her name across in bright lights. And in very North Korean fashion, they didn't want me taking pictures of the brewing equipment, so I just took a picture of this beer here in the foreground instead. This is the best coffee shop in Pyongyang. If any of you have the pleasure to visit, I can recommend the Pyongyang Hotel Coffee Shop on the 6th floor. They roast their own beans. They do pour-overs, as you can see. Their espressos, delightful, very fruity, blah, blah, blah. This coffee shop, as all coffee shops in Pyongyang, also illustrate nicely the effect that sanctions can have, and you see it in the price, because these people, they have to get a broker in Dandong to buy coffee beans from somewhere in China, and then they add their own markup for the last stage of getting the product into Pyongyang. You also sometimes see at other coffee shops an example of how North Korea's own rules impact the quality of the goods and services that people have. So, as you all know, communications are extremely restricted. It's very hard for a North Korean to be in touch with people in the outside world. And so if this lady's coffee machine breaks down, getting it fixed can be a complicated affair. You or I would be able to go online and find out perhaps the problem ourselves and fix it. If not, certainly we'd be able to get a hold of somebody who could help us. They will struggle to do so. E-commerce is also something they're looking at. This is a website, kind of a portal called Manmulsang, which means 10,000 products sold or produced. I'm not sure what the kanji is behind the sang, actually. And this is a place where businesses can list their products and services, and you as an individual or as a company can look it up on your phone and order. It's supposed to have an online payment system as well, although we're not sure if that's working. But you can certainly call, get something delivered, and then pay for it in cash. There's another platform called Sebyo, means new star. That also appears to include a chatting function to allow communication between businesses to take place a little more easily. And then people over the last few years, certainly in Pyongyang, have gotten increasingly used to a semi-cashless consumer environment. So almost everyone, or certainly a significant percentage of people, use cash cards that you load up with either hard currency or local currency, and then you can spend at shops around town. We keep hearing about mobile phone payments. You can link those cards with your phones. Ostensibly, we've never actually really seen it working. We're not sure if that's happening. You can get noodles delivered. I don't know who put that in there. Oh, embarrassing. The banking sector is also experiencing a perhaps minor revival. In 2009, they had a currency reform that destroyed the savings of the majority of people who certainly all those who kept their money in North Korean won. That perhaps was the absolute nadir of North Koreans' trust in non-cash holdings. The authorities are working really hard to try and build that trust back again. And I think those cash cards are interesting in that sort of training for using non-cash services to manage your money. And there's a class of people who now are earning enough that they can't just keep all the cash they have in their mattresses or their walls or buried in a village outside town. They need banking services. I was told that this is the most popular bank. It is now the KKG Bank. It used to be the East Asia Bank. Popular because everyone knows they can get their money whenever they want it. Their banks are also offering very high rates if you'll put your money in their institution. There you can see if you put over $5,000 for 3 months, you get 4.5% interest on that. 6 months is 6.5. 1 year, 7.5. If you put over $10,000, the rates are even better. This is a new innovation. I think I've seen these here in Tokyo, but a lot of major cities now have share bike services where you swipe a credit card and then you can return a shared bike to different locations. Those have just popped up this year. It's also a good example, the way that Manmulsang, the web portal is, it's a good example of how North Koreans are increasingly exposed to the outside world, mostly through China as sort of their window. And then they return home and really think hard about what they can emulate or what they can adapt. Okay, people don't have credit cards there, but perhaps if they show their mobile phone registration and we stamp their ticket, you can see there's a booth for somebody to sit in there, then we'll be able to run a similar bike rental service. Same with Manmulsang. Okay, we don't have the internet, but we could still get people onto our domestic network, our closed network, and help people trade with each other more easily. Advertisements are still largely absent. This is a notable example. This car that was a joint production between the Unification Church in South Korea and North Korea. Now it appears to be jointly run between North Korea and, well, certainly they're using Chinese parts to build cars that are branded in North Korea. I mentioned the property rights earlier. That's up in Rason. We're still waiting to see if they will push that experiment into other special economic zones or other locations. Property rights are a good example of something that's very difficult to address in the North Korean system, because admitting that exchange of property happens is like admitting that their socialist system is not operating the way it is supposed to. In that regard, apartments and other property bought and sold, everybody knows about it, but it's not really spoken about. all these changes in the economy have led to a real shift in perspectives for younger North Koreans. Certainly, if you were born in the early 90s or possibly even late 80s, you wouldn't ever really remember the Kim Il-sung system. Certainly, Kim Il-sung would be a historical figure for you. And you've also never, in that system, experienced getting everything that you needed from the state as your parents or your grandparents might have experienced. So not only food, but also clothing and appliances at one point would have been distributed to you based on how the state saw your value to society. Now you kind of have to find that stuff on your own, and in order to get that stuff you need to make money. And so this has caused a profound change in how people think about their lives. I mentioned before, by far the most exposure they have to the outside world is through China. We think perhaps there's 80 to 100,000 North Koreans that either live or are allowed to frequently go back and forth between China and North Korea quite frequently. That has made people in Pyongyang more cosmopolitan, even if it's through a Chinese lens. I think it's also made people less ideological. Doesn't mean they're not patriotic, they don't love their country and support a lot of its basic tenets, but they do want to live a more comfortable life, and they do want to see things run better. So if you have to choose between something running well and something running ideologically well, you may be more inclined to choose something running well. You also meet a lot of ambitious people, ambitious college graduates, who really see that there are some opportunities out there and want to take them. In that regard, if you ask people what's the best job, what kind of future are you looking for, diplomat is still a popular choice because it guarantees that you have some access to the outside world. And then being in trade or business, like a company that also has permission to trade with the outside world, is also seen as very, very attractive. So we do see that there's more wealth in Pyongyang over the last 5-6 years, and we do see that young people are increasingly attracted to jobs that will that will give them the chance to get their hands on some of that wealth. But pressure has been increasing, certainly since the last 2 nuclear tests. It is more difficult for North Koreans to operate abroad easily. It's tougher for them to get bank accounts than ever before. It's harder for them to ship than ever before. And indeed, the ban on coal exports has to hurt as well. It's difficult to see exactly, but if you look at the ban on coal exports, for example, and think about it in terms of that consumer economy, imagine a town of, say, 10,000 people that depends on a single coal mine up in Yangon province or somewhere. If that coal is no longer being exported, then suddenly that's a town of 10,000 people that is not earning any hard currency and is not participating in the domestic economy. They're not consuming. The more of those kinds of towns that are not consuming, the fewer customers for these companies that are creating new food products or textile products, and the more difficult it becomes. Yeah, I'll go ahead and stop there so we have plenty of time for questions and a little discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Andray, for that very informative presentation. I learned a lot of things about where to get my latte next time in Pyongyang, among others. But it was surprising to see so many images of things that we maybe associate more with our more commercial world than we typically think of Pyongyang and North Korea as. I'd like to open the floor to questions. As usual, we'll give preference first to members of the working press. So please raise your hands and step forward. Go ahead.
Oh.
Thanks so much. My name is Patrick Walter, German newspaper, Frankfurter Allgemeine. I have 2 questions. One is, you finished with the coal export. When early this year, put the question different. Do you really trust that these bans on exports are being is that China is really following up on that, or do you see that there is a ban really in place, or is it not in place? And the second question, if you think about entrepreneurs in North Korea, I mean, you need to get up some kind of capital to build up a business. Can you talk about that? Where do these people get the capital from, and how big is the risk that the state is going to expropriate them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Both great questions. The latter question, that is the biggest challenge for North Koreans. And because their access to the outside world is so limited, it's very, very hard to find seed capital to start things up. So it leads to a bunch of strange situations. For example, I met people from a tech company once, and we have these great programmers. We'd like to have people outsource their programming needs to us, and yada yada. Okay, well, what kinds of projects have you worked on? Well, right now we're running a shoe factory. Well, what? Why are you running a shoe factory? Well, no doubt because someone from their company met someone in China who said, I'm interested in a shoe factory, not this programming business. And they said, okay, fine. You have some capital. You're interested in the shoe factory. Let's do that. And that kind of thing happens all the time, because anytime you can find someone with a bit of capital and a bit of interest, you leap on it. China seems to be the overwhelming source of investment. Certainly external investment, the overwhelming amount comes from China. And increasingly, though, you see domestic investment taking place too. There's a class of people who have enough that they can invest in property or invest in these little subsidiaries that are housed in bigger companies or other institutions. And again, knowing those people and having them trust you to run a business, that can be tricky as well. In terms of the coal ban, there is some evidence. NK News is doing a nice job of tracking some instances that appear to be smuggling of coal. But parsing the North Korea-China trade relationship is so difficult. North Korea, if you look at Chinese statistics, has been running a deficit for years, over a decade. And it's not clear how they might be balancing that. Is it straight aid from China that's unreported? Is it stuff that is smuggled that we can't see? Is there stuff being bought for cash that's completely unreported to customs? It's extremely difficult to tell. So you'll get different guesses from different experts, I think.
More questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Daniel Hurst. I'm a freelance journalist. I think you mentioned something earlier on about state-owned enterprises and businesses being set up as sort of spin-offs or subsidiaries of those state-owned enterprises. Can you explain how someone actually on the ground would go about being an entrepreneur? Do you have to find some state-owned enterprise to sit it under before it really gets going? Or, like, what are the practicalities involved? And further to the last question, how much of the profit might eventually be taken by the state? Or what's typical in that situation? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question also. So imagine you're a young business person and you're working for a ministry, let's say the Ministry of Agriculture, and your uncle has a bit of money, or a Chinese person who has a bit of money, who's willing to invest in a machine to, say, turn potatoes into potato chips. You can go to your boss at the ministry and say, listen, I can turn our potatoes from these farms into potato chips and we can sell them here, and maybe overstate what you can do. We'll sell them in China, we'll sell them in Thailand, we'll sell them around the world. But you make a pitch. And your boss says, okay, we can house that project. Maybe we'll put you under a bigger state-owned enterprise, or maybe we'll make a new company that's officially attached to our Ministry of Agriculture. But it's your project. You run with it. You're making all the decisions on on both the inputs and finding the market for your product. That's tricky, obviously, because a lot of that is gray and informal, and so people are vulnerable in a real sense. It's not in a way that different to a lot of developing economies, though, where there are laws on the books, but in reality things are much more vague. And that's actually something you notice in North Korea when you're looking at how the economy is run. There's a lot of very unique North Korean quirks. It's not everywhere where the cabinet will send a message to every company and say, you have to provide us with X amount of plastic sheeting by December 1st, and then every company is scrambling to find plastic sheeting. But in terms of a lot of business activity happening in gray areas, that's pretty normal in a developing economy. Yeah, I guess that.
And how many of the profits? How much?
Yeah, what percentage of the profits are...
That's all, it happens in this gray area, and it depends on your relationship. And interestingly, though, increasingly there's an incentive to hide your profits as, again, a kind of a pretty normal thing, that the less you can get away with declaring, the less that you have to pay up to the authorities. What's very interesting and quite problematic in North Korea, though, is that there's no real taxation system. They abolished taxes in the 70s. It's something that they're very proud of. It's part of their orthodoxy, right? We've abolished taxes. Taxes are just a means of squeezing the working masses. That's their official line. So it's difficult for them to establish a kind of taxation system when that is what everybody is taught. So instead of having a central coffer where all business activities will pay taxes into, a Ministry of Finance in a more regular system, you have a really fragmented system too. So if I'm running my little chip factory with the Ministry of Agriculture, I make some profit, they'll get a little bit of it, but may not go any further than that, or maybe sometimes it does. So it's all very relational.
Okay. Yes.
Süddeutsche Zeitung, Neidhardt. First, a remark what you say about the creation of business opportunities sounds exactly like the last few years of the Soviet Union. I mean, I could tell you many shoe factory examples. It sounds very familiar to me. But my question is, you haven't said much about your students. How much are your students? Your students are taught the opposite from what they learned in school. Both the so-called communist ideology and the Juche, if there is something like Juche. I mean, they obviously don't have an idea what Juche is themselves. How much are they cynical about this contradiction of what you teach them and what they have learned before?
Yeah, that's a good question too, although maybe too good a question. You unpack so many things right there. So the people that Choson Exchange have trained range in age, usually from 20s all the way up to 50s. They range in class also. There's some people doing very well and people further down the scale. And you really get all kinds of people. You get people who are more or less cynical, more or less happy, people who work harder, less hard. I guess what I would say is it's not like you come in and try to contradict everything that they've learned, right? Coming in and saying like, you guys, this is all wrong. You should be doing it like this. That doesn't get you anywhere. But if you can come in and say, hey, in your system, what is possible? Could this be possible? Could this be possible? And then leave it up to them to manage how they think about how their actions as individuals fit into their system. And I think people resolve that in all kinds of ways. It really depends on the individual. Certainly, though, the most rewarding, the most fun part of working at Choson Exchange was bringing North Koreans abroad, especially when it was their first time abroad. Unfortunately, funding has become increasingly difficult for CE. With every nuclear test and every missile test, it gets a little bit more difficult. So we probably won't be bringing North Koreans abroad in the immediate future. But when you do bring them to Singapore, which is our hub, it's where we're based, and they see things that they recognize, like a heavy state hand in the economy, but also like a market that is being allowed to run more or less freely. I think they're able to imagine how their own economy and society could be run a little bit differently, and in the long run, I think that does change how people think generally for the better. Juche, that's a long discussion. Perhaps we can have it afterwards. Yeah.
So I have one question. The last questioner mentioned the Soviet Union, and it reminded me that when we saw a lot of images after the Berlin Wall fell of capitalism in Eastern Europe, right? And I remember the Benetton clothing store opened in Warsaw, but there was no one in it, and people couldn't actually afford to shop. Most people couldn't afford to shop at that store. So I'm wondering two things. One is, do you see? It's quite a different situation, obviously, but do you see any parallels between what happened in Eastern Europe and what's going on in very early stage in North Korea? And again, and how widely are these economic benefits being shared today?
It's difficult. It's difficult to answer. Their system really is unique and uniquely stable, I think, as we've all seen over the last 2.5 decades. A lot of people are surprised that the DPRK still exists, and yet they find a way. And part of that is based on the severe restrictions that their people are placed under. And while they've relaxed some of that, I think as long as certainly the nuclear and missile crisis goes on, they're unlikely to relax much further than they have already. That does impact how much wealth can be created. Ultimately, you're not going to see an economic takeoff there. You're not going to see a real miracle until some of these rules are relaxed, especially about access to information and communication. And then sanctions also play a limiting factor as well. So you do see wealth. It is primarily concentrated in the capital city, but that's something you also see in other places that have endured sanctions regimes. I've spent some time in Myanmar, and what happened there over the course of 2 decades is wealth was agglomerated into the capital, and the bigger players, when the pie is shrinking, it's the bigger, more powerful players that get to survive, and smaller, less well-connected companies go under. And one imagines that even though it's very difficult to see, something similar is taking place in North Korea as well. So there are limiting factors. And yet at the same time, there is a consumer class in Pyongyang, and you can see very easily how they're choosing to spend their money. Yeah.
Siegfried Knittel, freelancer from Germany. Some years ago, there was a discussion in North Korea. They wanted to develop a kind of own computer industry. I think there was a connection with a German company in Berlin about it. And there were some stories I read about the game industry in North Korea. They developed game for companies outside from North Korea. Do you know about it? Second question, how is the difference between Pyongyang and the countryside? You said the Pyongyang people are thinking a bit more cosmopolitan. But then the people in the countryside, what's their kind of thinking? Do you have any experience with?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, there are certainly some instances of outsourcing taking place in terms of programming, computing industries. There was a German company German DPRK joint venture called Nosotech that was looking to do just that, but I don't think they're active anymore. And part of that is because, again, it is more difficult. It's a higher risk to operate with overlapping unilateral and multilateral sanctions regimes, but it's also just a little bit too difficult to get things done. If I'm looking to outsource software programming, why wouldn't I pick Vietnam or Cambodia or anywhere where people are just online, and you can transfer terabytes of data over the internet, so I can send and receive things easily. It's just too difficult to do that in North Korea. As for the gap between Pyongyang and elsewhere, I've had a chance to travel to a few different places. Choson Exchange has run workshops in Wonsan on the east coast and in Rason, that SEZ in the far northeast. And then I've also gotten a chance to take other trips down to places like Kaesong and other cities like Sariwon, Myohyang Mountain, that kind of thing. There is definitely a gap. Part of that is to do with wealth, and a big part of that is to do with information. If you're living in Pyongyang and you're part of that middle class, you do know people that have been to China or go back and forth, and you work in a business like tourism or trade, where you do get to meet with foreigners and discuss things with foreigners. Really, if you're not in Pyongyang and also not up in Siniju or Rason on the border, your chances for those kinds of interactions are very, very limited. So you're less cosmopolitan, you're less likely to encounter outside ideas.
Other questions from anyone in the audience? You're welcome to. Go ahead.
Can you talk about a little bit what are your guesses? How big is the private economic sector in North Korea, and what's happening to these old industrial companies they had? Are they still productive? Are they just standing still, or how does it look like?
Yeah, very difficult, difficult question. I mean, I do think of their economy primarily as a market economy, and I think that's a big. A common mistake that people make is thinking of it as a state-owned command economy that is centrally planned and run. It is decreasingly like that. Every year it becomes less like that. So part of the reforms that the economic measures they took in 2012 and 2013 not only allowed, but in many cases forced the managers of state-owned enterprises to begin running their companies on market principles. So under the old model, if you were a toothpaste factory, you got given the ingredients for toothpaste. Well, I don't really know what goes in toothpaste. I was going to say gelatin, but I don't think that's right. You get given the toothpaste stuff and the plastics for the packaging and the machinery. The state would give you that and say, produce toothpaste for the masses, then we'll take it off you and we'll distribute it. Now it's much more the case where the factory owner has to find the ingredients for toothpaste and the plastic packaging, and then has to sell the toothpaste products for a profit. That he then also has to make decisions about how much do you reinvest in the factory, how much are you paying workers, how much has to go back to the state in some fashion. There are still some industries, particularly connected to the military, that are not run that way, but most state enterprises that we get some visibility on will at least in part be running on market principles.
Any other questions? Sure, go ahead.
It's a long walk from back there. Sorry.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Catherine Wortley. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm wondering if you could share some of the challenges that you've faced in your work. Have you had any opposition, for example, from very traditional conservative people in North Korea, whether it's officials or local people themselves? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, sure. Definitely in North Korea, we know that some people and some institutions are relatively suspicious of what we're doing. There's certainly a group of people and institutions who want to maximize control, right? And then there are others who want to maximize efficiency as far as possible, and they're often in conflict with one another. Thus far, I think we've been able to continue running programs in North Korea. We've been able to make the case that we're assisting them in ways that they really need, and thus far it's worked out. We also face opposition abroad a little bit too, perhaps not as much as you might think, but certainly. Some conservatives, especially in South Korea, would like to see no interaction whatsoever between North Koreans and the outside world. And more than opposition, I think the problem we faced has been funding, which I referenced earlier. We came along in 2010, so it was shortly after the 2009 nuclear test, where we began running programs, and we thought, well, this is a difficult period, but it probably won't get harder than this. Turned out to keep getting harder and harder, and really at this point, it's hard to see what the off-ramp is for this conflict between North Korea and the international community. It could stretch on for quite some time, or who knows, there may be some kind of resolution that we're failing to imagine. But as long as this nuclear missile crisis continues, it's really hard for any group that's working in country, but especially in an area that can be a little sensitive. Yeah.
Yes, Bradley.
Bradley Martin, freelance author. I'd like to continue on this topic that we were just on right here. Basically, sanctions, if you carry them to an extreme, you choke the economy off and you force change in this fashion. That's obviously what people like Josh Stanton and some others are looking for, right? The sanctions purists. On the other hand, if you followed the engagement approach exclusively, and you could count on, the economy will change, and then of course the society will change. That's what we thought about China, of course, and anyway. But where should we be on that continuum? Should we be somewhere in the middle, or should we be squeezing more, or should we be helping more? Do you have a personal view on this that you can share with us, especially on a day like this when everybody can look at and say, "Whoop, excuse me. Hey, can you hear me?"
Mm-hmm. It's fine. Yeah, we're hearing you.
Okay. So on a day like this, everybody can say, well, every extra buck that you get into North Korea, by definition, is going into building missiles that are going to be aimed at Alaska, Hawaii, and eventually in New York. So it may be a good day to explore this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's extremely difficult, right? It's been a puzzle that I think people have been thinking about for a couple of decades now, and no easy solutions have presented themselves. I think when you think about what's happening in the North Korean economy, you have to admit a couple of things. First, because so much of it is marketized and fractured, it's extremely difficult to chop off parts that are really central to the state and to the missile and nuclear programs that are so problematic. It also means that you can't really apply sanctions without hurting the people of North Korea. So, there's been a lot of literature about targeted sanctions in the last few years and how effective they may or may not be. It's just difficult to imagine them being able to target core institutions involved in the missile and nuclear program without hurting ordinary people. So that's something that we have to consider. I think the other problem is that for sanctions to work, you have to have a coalition of sending states, right? And that coalition has always been problematic with North Korea. And even now, where sanctions are tighter than ever, you still have a China that does not want to see instability. So China also has by far the best information on what's going on in the North Korean economy. I suspect perhaps even better than the North Koreans themselves. They have thousands of people running businesses, or the Huajiao, the ethnic Chinese that go back and forth all the time. They have consulates or offices in several cities in a way that no other country has, and a huge embassy in Pyongyang. So they really, really know what's going on. And I think they will be able to smell a crisis far earlier than anyone else, and then we'll be able to take steps to make sure it doesn't turn into a full-blown collapse. And then also in South Korea, if for some reason the Chinese miss it and a crisis does develop and we see images of starving people again like we did in the 90s, I'm not sure the South Korean population would also keep that sanctions coalition together. They would want to help. So applying sanctions still very, very problematic. Engagement also problematic. Like we have to come up with some kind of response to the nuclear and missile programs. We can't just say like, okay, fine, you've won, you did it, you're a nuclear power. That's also not acceptable certainly to the United States and also to other major actors in the region. So what do you end up doing? It's extremely difficult. I don't have a very good answer, but at least I feel like nobody really has a very good answer, so I'm not on my own there.
Back to the question of Pyongyang versus the countryside. What is it like in Rason, where there is a special economic zone, and presumably there's a bit more of an economy than elsewhere? Is it somewhere in between Pyongyang and the countryside? How would you describe that?
I would describe it as somewhere in between Pyongyang and the countryside. Well phrased, I think.
Sorry,
it is. They've just had so much more exposure to foreigners, Chinese mostly, a little bit Russian, that they're, in terms of how people treat you, it's far more relaxed. You go a lot of places in North Korea, and there's foreigners. People get a little nervous. They don't know what to do. In Rason, people will quite happily ignore you. And there's also well-established industries there that are running and have run for years, if not decades. Fishing being a big one, and also some textiles. But seafood is the big business up there. And yeah, you see the buildings are okay, and there is also a bit of spending that goes on. The market there is huge. I think possibly still the biggest in the DPRK. You can get pretty much anything in there, from electronics to all kinds of food items, and yeah, so there's a degree of not only food security but also comfort that comes from being a Rasonite. Not sure if that's the demonym there, Rasoner, compared to other places because of that interaction with the outside world. Wonsan is a place that could also be that way if somehow a breakthrough is found between Tokyo and Pyongyang. In 2013, 2014, there's a bit of dialogue between Pyongyang and Tokyo trying to see if there might be some sort of interim resolution to the abduction issue. If trade were allowed again, I think we'd see something similar happen in Wonsan that we've seen in Rason. And maybe, in the long term, that's a strategy for economic and social change too, is seeing different parts of the country altered through trade and investment relationships. But again, then there's geopolitical problems that are stopping that from happening.
Any more? Yeah, go ahead, Siegfried.
It's not fair. I feel like I should get up as well and answer everything and walk over there. Sorry.
Get some exercise.
So, do you think engagement with North Korea or kind of this, to open the country a bit step by step, it could be a opportunity to undermine the regime, and then people then at the end would vote for a change, or this are the people in North Korea open for a kind of a change, for what if they learn what's happened in the outside world? I think there was some years ago a lot of discussion about if the internet, if the more information from outside world comes to North Korea by CD and movies, and this could undermine the regime. What do you think? This is a way to undermine, and should government think in going this way with dealing with North Korea?
I think there's a lot of wishful thinking in that regard when it comes to North Korea. It's a society that's proved surprisingly resilient, and I think will probably continue to be resilient in the face of quite a bit of pressure. I think rather than hope for some kind of dramatic thing like that, in a way, I think it would be useful to look at China. Brad referenced China, and sure, it never became a Jeffersonian democracy, but it's, I think, very difficult to argue that China of today is a worse place than China in 1980. And so I think we can reasonably hope that some of the changes that have taken place in China could be replicated or adapted for North Korea. Again, as long as this conflict takes place, though, there really is an ascendancy of conservatism in Pyongyang as well. Like, as long as this goes on and they feel they're surrounded by enemies, especially when now they kind of have the economy working well enough, I think they don't have much of an incentive to experiment further, which is, in my view, unfortunate.
Yes, go ahead.
Daniel Hurst again. Just a quick follow-up on what the picture is like for entrepreneurs or people who want to be form their own businesses who are women. So how is it different for women compared to the men? And more broadly, your students, do they have to be well connected to be successful? I'm just trying to flesh out whether this sort of entrepreneurship is actually a way out for people in poverty, or whether you still have to be well connected, like who gets the benefits. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for queuing that up so I can talk a little bit about Choson Exchange's Women in Business program, which was one of the things I enjoyed doing most at Choson Exchange. Helping female entrepreneurs is so important everywhere, but I think especially there, where, like a number of conservative East Asian countries, there is a pretty solid glass ceiling. So you look at the very top of society, and men tend to be running things. In North Korea, towards the bottom rungs of society, women have been incredibly important since the 90s. They were the ones that really found economic responses to the crises they faced in food security. The sort of class we deal with, obviously the best case scenario is that you're well connected. You've got great connections in government and in private industry and everywhere. That's the best situation, and there are definitely women like that. If not, though, again, like everywhere where there are every developing economy where there are a lot of gray areas, it's kind of about leveling up your contacts, and you have to be extremely shrewd to do that, right? It's not dissimilar in Myanmar or other places I've lived, where if you become slightly more successful, then you get other people and institutions that are interested in what you're doing, and then you have to manage them. And if you manage them well, maybe you can become even more successful and kind of work your way up a social and economic ladder through being a good businesswoman. I don't know if that's a terribly satisfying answer, but women there, like everywhere, incredibly important to support. And again, unfortunately for us at CE, funding constraints mean that we've really had to reduce that Women in Business program. Yeah.
We're running out of time, so any more questions? And if not, going once, going twice. I'd like to thank Andray for spending some time with us this afternoon and sharing some of his insights into a place where most of us haven't had an opportunity to visit. And as is our tradition, we'd like to present him with a one-year honorary membership in the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan.
Yes.
So we hope to see more of you here. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Oh. Thank you. Cool. Oh, it's actually printed out. It's fantastic.